Hi, I'm John Cutterback.
And I'm Sofia Cutterback.
If you're wondering whether you can really be friends with your spouse
and raise children into responsible adults with whom you have a relationship,
and do what it takes to make a homestead, reconnecting with your body and the land wherever you live.
If you just want to think more about how to make a truly happy home in our trying times,
then the Intentional Household, a LifeCraft podcast, is for you. Join us. Hi, I'm John Cutterback. Always happy to have my wife, Sofia, with me for the Intentional Household, a LifeCraft podcast. Today's episode is Raising Children Who Make Good Decisions Once They Leave Home. We try to pick those topics that are hot ones, kind of on everyone's mind. And that's certainly one that's been very much on our mind for many years and remains on our mind. And we love thinking about it together, don't we, dear?
Yes, we do, for sure. It's kind of an exciting topic. I have to say, it makes me think a little bit of reading a dinner menu and the desserts. You know, children who make good decisions once they leave home. That seems like an entry on the dessert part of the menu. So
that takes a while to get to. In other words,
yeah.
And like so like some of us spend dinner thinking about what's coming afterwards, almost like you get through. That's the way we were when we were children. I mean, get through the main part of dinner.
Some of us are still like that.
In order to get to dessert, and you can kind of miss dinner. And it's funny that you use that analogy, because it actually really strikes me that I wonder whether that's a danger. It is so easy to look to the future and think, gosh, if we can just make it through and have succeeded in raising our children, well, that's what we're looking for here. But that could make us miss the dinner itself. The raising of the children is not as difficult as it is. It's certainly not simply something to get through.
Mm-hmm, sure. And of course, our parents used to tell us when we were little, you can't have dessert unless you have dinner. So in the same way, unless you really kind of live the earlier part in the right way, you can't expect that dessert's going to happen. So Anyway, maybe that's funny. That was kind of spontaneous, but maybe that was in fact a good analogy.
Well, so maybe by thinking about it, we can help ourselves discover more how all these things that we're going to need to do, and obviously it's quite complex in art. What art compares with the art of raising children? In many ways, it is kind of the art of life. Mm-hmm. But we're narrowing in. But we're focusing on certainly a key aspect of it. When we say raising children who are going to make good decisions once they leave, I mean, you could use that to kind of sum up the whole thing.
Yeah.
But I think using that particular approach will help us focus on certain key aspects of what we're doing in the home that are always worth a closer look, and hopefully give us some concrete takeaway points.
Yeah. So I suggest that maybe we actually take the title itself and break it into two parts: raising children who make good decisions once they leave home. Let's talk about what is a good decision. I think we need to maybe define that first before we can really talk about what we do in order to make that happen. How would you define a good decision? The kind of good decisions we want our children to be making once they leave home?
I like that. That's very Aristotelian of you. In other words, we have to have a very clear view and understanding, conception of the goal. Mm-hmm. And obviously in the title, we've kind of posed that as the goal. Yeah. To have the children make good decisions, but what are good decisions? Well, okay, let's get philosophical here, and think about, is there an objective standard? Surely, I mean, many today are kind of saying, well, forming people, raising children is fundamentally just helping them clarify their own interests, right, and kind of figure out what they want to do, and we're nervous about imposing anything upon them. Well, I think we start with a presupposition here and a confidence that we can, using our human reason, especially human reason aided by divine grace and divine revelation, there are some very key objective features of what good decisions look like. And we can say that corresponds with human nature, that there are things that are in accord with human nature, which also means something we could call natural law. But I tend to go further with a kind of further decision, it's one thing just to make a good decision in the sense of choosing to do the right thing, but something Aristotle would right off the bat point out is you not only want to choose the right thing, but you want to choose it in the right way.
Wow.
You want to choose it for the right reason, right? And so, particularly in the context of thinking about raising children, um, we could picture someone who maybe makes the right decisions or tends to make the right decisions, but is doing so because that child is terrified of punishment or being told that he's
Or
wrong,
rejection.
and so he makes the right decisions, but he's not really making the right decisions in the right way, in that fuller way that we would want.
Wow. So that's even a further distinction we want to split things into, not just making a good decision, but actually doing it in the right way, wanting to choose the good, the better.
Exactly. And you've naturally just said kind of what Aristotle's point there, that kind of the key feature there is when he says, you don't just want someone to choose or decide to do the virtuous thing, but to choose to do so because it's the virtuous thing.
Yeah.
Another way of putting that is because he's seen this truly is the good life. This is, as it were, what I'm made for. This is what my heart wants.
Yeah, you want something. Yeah. Wow, that's very. Of course, I realize as soon as you say that, I kind of have this intuitive feeling of course, that's what I want when I think of my children as full-grown adults and making decisions on their own. I want them to want the good things, not just do the good things, but I actually want them to want the good things. Wait, but before we go on, I have to push you a little bit here to describe a little bit more. You said you described the good. And when we were talking about choosing the good as being something that's consonant with our natural desires, our human nature. You have to flesh that out a little bit more for me because I feel like there's a little bit, our desires, the things that we want are very often malformed. A 5-year-old wants dessert before he has his dinner, right? So just you have to give me a little bit more distinction there so that we get a sense of the difference between kind of something that is pleasing to us and something that is consonant with our human nature in a deeper or more profound way. So
good. Well, that's a great opportunity here to kind of then stick on the theme here. Virtue formation, because that's one way of casting this. To grow in a virtue is to grow in kind of the double way that we just referred to. It's both doing the right thing and wanting to do the right thing, and it's in having this become what Aristotle and then the medieval tradition too call a kind of second nature. Virtues, though, are a kind of second nature that is in accord with and a fulfillment of our, quote, first nature, human nature itself. And this is, which is the ultimate objective standard. So in other words, to get concrete, something like being just, being courageous, being temperate, naming cardinal virtues here. These second natures, these habits, these virtues are the natural kind of fulfillment, flowering of what it means to be human. And so that's where it's key that we have the right understanding of human nature, of kind of what human nature is designed to be. What is our full fulfillment? What does it look like? Well, it looks like being virtuous. And so it always, we're in the mode, philosophically speaking here, of trying to discern what is it that most brings us to be who we are in the sense of what we're designed to be. And part of the reason there is this issue where that needs to be enunciated, and it's very good that you bring it up, is because you're pointing out that often by maybe nurture or by what goes along with that, our own choices, we start to have certain dispositions that where we feel like this is us, this is who we are, but it's actually not in accord with our true inner nature. This is actually a very good point to point out that this is why such a person would be unhappy, living a vicious life, living a life of not choosing in accord with the fundamental inclinations of our nature. There's a discord there. There's an interior lack of peace, a dissonance that will always be there. And you can see that in the way that we'll tend to feel guilty or feel like something's off in our life, though very often we keep doing it, because that's a reminder to us that there is our real given nature in us kind of always speaking. Whereas on the other hand, when we are growing in real virtues, there's this profound interior peace because there's this consonance, there's this harmony of the way we are choosing to become fits with what we were designed to be. And that's why Aristotle has this great conviction that being virtuous is human fulfillment, is human happiness. And you're always more happy when you do this because it is exactly how you were designed. How are we doing?
Yeah, that's great. I think that's really helpful. That if I can just recap in kind of layman's terms, just to make sure I'm understanding it correctly, that the virtues are ways of acting that best correspond with how we're designed as human beings. And so the ancient philosophers have studied this human nature, how we're designed to be, and they've talked about or enunciated the cardinal virtues, for example. And so we can actually look at those cardinal virtues as these are ways that human beings are designed. So if we act this way, our human design, we will be most happy. So kind of to use a practical example, I'm always, I'm so manic about my sewing scissors. I've written on all sides of my sewing scissors, do not use on paper. Do not use them. You can use the scissors on paper, but it will kind of ruin. They're not designed for that. And so
it's okay by use on cardboard, right?
Sweetheart, okay. No.
Sorry.
You just couldn't resist. I'm never quite certain when Raphael's going to end up with my scissors on cardboard, but it ruins the scissors. You can use the scissors on cardboard, but it ruins them. They don't work very well. In the same way, human beings can do all kinds of things. They can choose to do things that they like, but if they're not actions that are consonant with the way we're designed, it's actually going to break the human being down. Right. For a while, my sewing scissors might keep working, but very rapidly they don't. But soon they don't even work on cardboard anymore, right? So would you say that that's kind of a good analogy? I know people don't like especially as regards parenting and formation of the young, to impose a virtue principle on their children. Whereas in fact, kind of, it sounds like what you're saying is the virtues, what we call the virtues, are actually kind of from tried and true observation of human nature, an observation of these are the functions that best correspond, support, grow, and develop and bring human nature to its real fulfillment.
Good. 100% with you. But let's point out, use an important word, kind of impose. What's imposing versus what's not imposing. At the end of the day, given the rich nature of this thing called virtue we're talking about, virtue can't be imposed on someone, but we can act so as to cultivate it in them and try to lead them towards it. But of course, some people would even call that imposing, right? But that's where I say it's not imposing. If we know and come to a conviction about basic truths about what is good for our children, obviously it's not imposing on them to try to convey that to them, to try to teach that to them, and further to help habituate them to it. But even from the start, I mean, it's funny. In some sense, you can make children do certain things, but in a sense, you can't ever really make them do things. You can't make them perform a fully human action, because a fully human action comes from their own choice.
Yeah.
So it's a profoundly delicate. Again, there's nothing like this. There's nothing like the training of a dog is a pretty complex, amazing thing. This is on another planet. From even if there are certain analogies, it's the beauty, the stakes involved here, the subtlety of the personal relationship involved, and the understanding of the dignity of that human person that we're forming to try to bring towards virtue. Whew.
Yeah. Wow, that's really amazing. Before we move on to that, because obviously that's kind of where we want to go, this question of making your children, because that's, of course, make is in our first part of our description, our title here, and I really want to, we're going to go back to,
yes, children who make.
I know, okay, but we have to be careful because make is in there, and I think that it just kind of subtly we begin to go making our children, but we're not talking, we're not going to, but let's not talk about that yet. Before we move on, I just want to say then, when we say good decisions, raising children who make good decisions when they leave home, we're talking about then children making decisions that are consonant with their human nature. and that help them to flourish. Would that be a great way of describing that first part that we're discussing, the end of our
absolutely
description?
with the further two quick just clarifications? Yes, totally yes. I just want to add, and also for those of us coming from a faith perspective, it's then also good decisions in accord with then their supernatural calling, not just their natural calling, but their supernatural calling, which goes hand in glove with, or it is the fuller flowering of their natural calling.
Excellent.
And includes their natural calling. Yes. And also just don't forget the distinction of included. It's not just we want them to make good decisions in accord with their natural and supernatural calling, but we want them to make those decisions well for the right reason from the heart.
Yeah.
Because they this is what they want.
Yeah.
And indeed, they're acting from their love.
Yeah. So wow, that's a picture of a really wonderful adult. That's just really, boy, you do really want that, don't you?
It is. And the thing is, we will never be a sufficient cause of that. In other words, we will never, in all of our efforts, it will never be that, well, if we do all of this just right, then they will necessarily be that, right? But we can be never a sufficient cause, but we can be a real cause.
Yeah.
And a very significant cause that can help bring them towards that. And again, this is always going to remain complex. Obviously, we're not going to be able to sort it all out, but this is so worth our continuing to think about. This just reminds me of Socrates saying, I spend my days thinking about virtue. And he didn't directly say the next words, but immediately implied is, and how you become virtuous and how you help other people become virtuous. In a sense, that's what we're talking about here. This is hopefully the stuff of spouses conversations, not at this altitude necessarily, not what we're talking about every day, the philosophical principles, but hopefully we are starting to know have some philosophical grounding, but then we're going to be spending a lot of time in the weeds, looking at the practicals, but in view of hopefully an ever clearer conception of what we want to do for our children. I think if nothing else, we've started to see here, it's very, very much a matter of forming their hearts, forming their wants, forming their desires. What does it take that our children love what is good, and that it be their joy to choose well, that it be their joy to choose the wonderful and the beautiful things, and to eschew the ugly and the base, the evil, obviously. That's we're working, we at least can start with the confidence we're working with their nature. And I certainly also say, from a faith perspective, we're fulfilling a God-given role to help bring them to where God wants them to be. And so it's certainly going to be a matter for our ongoing prayer and humility, and recognizing ultimately we're going to ask God to give us wisdom in doing this. But he is calling us to do. We can't just say, okay, Lord, we put him in your hands, now you do it. It's okay to say you do it if by that we mean, Lord, you empower us to do this, because we are, that's the role that we've been given. And we're only going to be able to do it by his grace, I think. But shall we start to then, the second part, of course, is then the raising.
Yeah. And so, of course, the thing that kind of leads us into that second part, first of all, I just have to bring you back to the line that you said, which I think is just so great. It's so dynamic, is you can't make anyone be virtuous. By its definition, virtue is something that has to come from the interior of the person. So we're talking about virtuous adults. So you can't make a virtuous adult. And then you said something just now when you were speaking that I think kind of points us in the right direction, is that we can create an environment that fosters, cultivates, and grows their appetite, so that they want the good things. So I think that maybe that gives us direction where we can start talking about how do we do this. And I think it's kind of interesting. We're talking about adults that make good decisions, but really where that centers our conversation is on the child. So not the adult, but it's actually kind of centers our whole conversation on what happens long before they become the adult, because then the adult time is actually what they're doing. The little child time is where our role comes in. So let's talk about that.
You have a lot of thoughts on this too, and I'm just going to throw out a couple. The first big distinction I would make is starting with who we are, starting with simply the aspect of kind of leading by example. in distinguishing that from, at the same time, concrete things we will do towards them. But I think we always begin with ourselves. And, something that really strikes me is, we know this is an obvious importance. Well, we have to lead by example, but let's lean into that a little bit and just really see how much is going on there. One thing I always start with confidence in is that by a wonderful, natural, thus divine plan, being parents is a way of calling us as parents to become ourselves. And so this whole thing of what do we want them to become is always first going to throw us back on how are we doing?
Yeah.
Because it's obvious, but remind ourselves again and again and again, we can't lead them somewhere or push them to somewhere that we're not at least very seriously pursuing ourselves. So do we, these very principles we talked about, to what extent are we virtuous? To what extent are we choosing, making good decisions the right way? And here, this great Aristotelian point of, that really to be virtuous is to choose out of love and desire, which means that we choose it with a certain joy. If we don't look happy in the right decisions that we're making, are they, even if we're patterning for them right decisions, what if we're patterning that making right decisions makes you be miserable?
Yeah. It's a
Or
burden.
totally stressed, or this isn't any fun, or why do we have to do this? Children are incredibly astute on that, on that, and that's scary, because to a certain extent, you want to just think, all right, look, I'm trying so hard over here. I'm forcing myself to keep making good choices, and so I can pattern that for my children. But this sense of it almost you could say could backfire. Of here I am making the right choices, but not making it look like something particularly they'd want to do. I'm like, nah, I think I'll do something else.
Yeah, I always say that children are so brutal that way. They immediately hone into what is on your heart, not so much even what you're doing or what you're saying. And so they just hold your feet to the fire so intensely, and they reveal your heart to you, really.
That's a good point.
If you are willing to see that what they're mirroring back to you is your own heart. And that's really hard for us as parents sometimes, that sometimes the bad behavior or the disordered desires that our children have might be, and most likely are mirroring back to us what in fact is underneath the language and in our hearts.
Wow.
And I love that, actually. I think that's really great. I'm grateful because it so makes us, the Lord wants us to be better people. He doesn't want us just to have good children. He wants us to be better people. And so he sends us our children, and he gives us this great task of helping form them. And we realize that in order to do that, we have to look at ourselves with greater scrutiny.
That's right. That's really great. No, I love it too. Wow. What a funny gift, a gift that can be kind of like a punch in the face of learning that about yourself. Okay, great. And with the kind of urgency of, oh, okay. And by the way, now that you've just learned this about yourself, you at the same time saw that to the extent that you're kind of falling short there, you're not in the position to be leading them, helping them, guiding them the way that we want to. And I want to immediately right there say, look, we have to be able to have at one and the same time high ideals and a sense of mercy, and kind of, as it were, giving quarter to patience, not just with them, but with ourselves, right? This also gives us the opportunity to recognize if this makes us be impatient and too hard on ourselves, then we got the same problem. They're going to be impatient and too hard on themselves. So again, it can seem, oh my gosh, it is so demanding, but it's not unforgiving. Because I think if we always come back to confidence in, we can start again, we can appeal to the mercy of God. We start, okay, we're going to, from wherever we are, we're going to try to take it to the next step. That's something that we're patterning for them. And patterning, there's a certain joy in that. And we can choose to be at peace in, okay, kind of in a certain humility. I've seen this about myself. I accept it. I'm going to be working on that. All that is part of part of what they're taking in.
Sure. Yeah. And that's important. Now, of course, all of us parents, we're definitely on the way. And in a certain sense, it's almost kind of, there are certain things that you can't even work on until you're a mature adult. So of course, that kind of presupposes, we go into this broken and not having the right desires, et cetera. Do you have any recommendations of how we as adults can start trying to foster better desires, the kind of in response to the doing the right thing, but not, kind of doing it because it's right, but not really wanting to do it. How can do you have any suggestions about how we as parents can start fostering better appetites in ourselves?
Yeah.
How can we love what is the right thing to do?
Of course, the great news is this: whatever the principles apply there are then at least going to be the foundation
Yeah, of course.
for what we're going to convey to them.
Sure.
And here, this is a little bit of an oblique answer to your question, but I just want to say it. We've in this podcast and another one talked about friendship, the spousal friendship, and what just really struck me right there was these demands of self-examination and what are we going to do to grow should push us back towards open our eyes to how important it is to go back to the spousal relationship. And it's so easy to forget that. Well, what do I need to do to be a good father? And okay, I need to grow. I need to be a better example. I need to have a better relationship with my wife. And there is the God-given kind of center point of how, where, and how I should be working on my relationship. I'm growing in character, and even growing closer to the Lord. Is in many ways centered on this kind of first and primary vocation of how are we working together to deepen our interior life, to grow in virtue together. There's so many ways. I just was I was doing this, writing a wonderful thesis on marriage, and actually was considering as part of it the how a gift in marriage is the challenge of growing in chastity together. I just want to point out here, marriage is designed to call us up, to demand a bit of us, and to give us the opportunity to transform our desires, to grow in the cardinal virtues. And even right there, that we're trying to grow in virtue together in our relationship with one another as spouses. This is the fundamental thing. That's again the fundamental patterning. So that was an oblique answer to how are we going to transform our desires, but I just want to invoke the Aristotelian principle. Central to growing in virtue always is deepening friendships that are the context for that growing in virtue. This is a big part of why parents are a man and a woman who are married to one another, who have committed themselves to spend all of their time and energy and focus on growing in virtue and transforming their desires together.
Yeah, and that's Aristotle.
It is.
So this is pre-Christian. This is a pagan philosopher who's looking at the design of human nature, and he's talking about the importance of a man and a woman committed in marriage. Wow, that's incredible.
And now Christianity ups the ante here big time, then even by making marriage be a sacrament and a sign of Christ's fidelity to the church. Sure. It is, if you're going to be a sign of Christ's fidelity, again, there's so much packed into that in our trying to grow in virtue, transform our desires, grow closer to the Lord.
I just think that's really interesting because so many times, especially in the atmosphere that we're in nowadays, they think that marriage between a man and a woman that is exclusive and permanent is something that's religiously imposed. Right. And it's just so extraordinary that this pre-Christian pagan philosopher came to the same conclusion, obviously not understanding the full richness, just from looking at human nature. That's really, I have to say that when I asked you the question about give us some practical advice, I was totally not expecting you to say that. Yeah. And I'm just fascinated to hear you say that because as you're saying, talking about the importance of spouses and their relationship with one another, actually, I think becomes incredibly important. And one of the fundamental ways in which we prepare our children to be able, or I say not prepare our children, I say create an appetite in our children for the good. And I think one of the fundamental ways is by building a relationship with our children. And there are a lot of different ways of doing that, and it involves different things. And so we can talk about the practical details. But if that's true, that a relationship is kind of fundamental and important, we're talking about the relationship of the child with the parent, one or the other or both of them together. And you could see that if a child grows up in an environment where the parents are working on a relationship with one another in a faithful and committed way, whatever their difficulties are, they're always coming back and they're always committing to continue to work for the sake of the other. That already in itself says to the child, I'm worthy to be in a relationship with. You can trust me.
That's a great point.
I'm safe. You can trust me. And so, in fact, it does create a safe environment for the child because, of course, when parents have a better relationship with one another, it is a safer and better relationship for the child.
Right.
But also from the perspective of inviting the child into a relationship of trust, because obviously this is what the parent has to do, has to guide the child as to what's good, what should you like, what should you desire. And the child has to have reason to place their trust in the parent. And they can easier do that when they see the parents are working on a relationship with one another.
Amen. And let's just take that to the next natural step. Key in any relationship is, as Aristotle pointed out when just simply talking about virtuous friendship, is really and truly looking to the good of the other person. Now, this is a very simple point, but let's focus for a moment here, because I think, that we can talk about that in the spousal relationship, but let's go ahead and focus. You're talking about children being able to have trust, confidence in the relationship with the parent. If there's one thing that a child needs to feel from his parent, is that the parenting is stemming fundamentally from a love for the child. In other words, that everything that the parent is going to do here is about how can I love you? How can I bring you to where I so badly want you to be for your sake? Now, this sounds incredibly obvious, but I mean, I just have to share it from my own perspective. I'm just going to get very concrete here because it will help illustrate it. How many times have I gotten angry when my children do something wrong, where it's been very easy to say to myself, well, the reason I'm angry is because I really badly want them to do the right thing. They're not doing the right thing. That's why I'm angry. It's very easy to have that account. And surely there's something of that in there. I think what so easily creeps in the case, if I'm just perverse in this way and it doesn't apply to others, well, then others don't need to apply it to themselves, and they can be grateful that they're not me. But I have absolutely discovered that often that anger is more self-referential. I'm angry because I feel like the child is failing me. The child is showing me to be a failure. I feel frustrated in my project of being a good parent, and it's not that I don't still, of course, love my child and want my child to flourish, but I absolutely have had this self-discovery of it's one thing to say, yes, I'm doing this all out of love for you. It's another thing really to do that, to feel that, and have the child feel that. And that's why I think often children can be legitimately offended when their parents have gotten mad, where I have to think, if the anger were really experienced by them as a truly kind of justified anger that's about their good, I'm angry because you are hurting yourself. It would that anger might be hard for them, but it wouldn't offend them the way that I know I have offended my children in times of anger, where then in self-reflection afterwards I realize it was not about them. And so I give that as an example of I know I need to look again. How are they experiencing our relationship, my desire for relationship? What ultimately are my desires toward them? There's, of course, they know we love them, but we need to love them better. And there absolutely are degrees here, and the extent that we more succeed in doing it, in kind of purifying ourselves and really training ourselves to look to the good of the other, which we all know is extremely difficult. That's part of the reason that we find our spousal relationship so difficult. We know it constantly demands more of us, or more that at times we just almost don't feel up to giving. Well, parenting is the exact same way. Does this connect to helping children make good decisions? I think this is the root, because the root is relationship. Are they going to trust us? They want to go where we're trying to lead them.
It seems to me like what you're describing there about your anger actually being more about your own issues than that goes back to the very beginning cautionary note that you sounded at the very beginning of our conversation, which is if you're looking at the dessert, then you're not going to do dinner right.
No, good point.
So in that way, if you're really concerned about, I really want to make an adult who's making good decisions once they leave the house, chances are pretty good that that's what you're obsessed about, and not actually seeing the child and they're good right now, here and now where they are. And the child who has this exquisitely, finely tuned emotional immune system feels that right away.
Yep, they do.
And I think the worst thing about that is that you use the word offended, and it's a way of describing it. But I think even worse than offended, the child feels that there is a chasm between him and his parent, when his parent is more about himself and his interaction with the child. The child actually feels a separation or a distance. Mommy or daddy are over there. They're interested in their own thing. And I just need them to be looking at me, but they keep being more interested in this thing that's inside of them. And they're looking down at that crystal ball in their hand. Daddy, I need you to look at me. Mommy, look at me, and so I think worse than that is they feel isolated and alone.
I think it's a great point. And this can seem brutal.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I just want to say right here, well, life in certain ways, it's not brutal, but it is very difficult. It's very demanding, and it's always going to stretch us. This is my experience of life. This is my experience of life through spending a lot of time reading great wise people like Plato and Aristotle. And frankly, it's certainly my understanding of trying to think about life through the eyes of the Lord. We were made for something very great. And it demands a lot. And at times it can seem to have been almost too much. How are we supposed to do this? This is what courage is a cardinal virtue. Cardinal means a hinge. To be ready to keep going after that arduous good. We always have to remind ourselves it is to go with our limited analogy, the dessert in question is absolutely that great. Mm-hmm. The good that we're going for,
it's worth having dinner over.
is so profound. The kind, again, it brings such joy to the heart to even just think about having raised a child that would be this kind of person, the very kind of person that we likewise are trying to become. And we should never forget or pretend as though we are perfect or already more that person than we are. But to the extent that we are honestly, earnestly, intentionally continuing to do that and hold ourselves to that high standard and trying to purify ourselves in our intention, our heart towards them. This is what's going to sharpen the metal. This is what's going to bring us to where we want to go and where we want to bring them. But maybe we should, though, get more concrete. Okay, so here we are. We realize the importance of relationship, mm-hmm. Continually kind of purifying our heart, asking ourselves why are we doing what are we doing what we're doing? Why are we upset when things are not going well? Maybe let's just go ahead and get more concrete. I'm going to ask you, do you have any? I have a couple in my mind. What are some concrete things we can do to try to form our children so that they want good things?
Yeah. So I definitely would. The foundation, I think, is building a relationship with the child where they see you as someone they can trust, to see them, and also trust to themselves that you yourself see what is good and can tell them what that is. And so I think that kind of one of the first things I go back to is very often we put children into a compartment as though they're like some kind of subspecies or not fully human yet, and we treat them as something completely different from human beings. But in fact, children are like the adults that are raising them. So in a lot of ways, as parents, I think it's helpful for us to say to ourselves, well, what would I feel like if someone, told me to clean up my bedroom that way? I think that sometimes we fall into these patterns of, well, they're children and I'm the adult and they didn't clean their room. So I can say to them, you get in there and clean up that room. Maybe the child needs to hear in no uncertain terms that they need to obey, but that's not a respectful way of saying that to a child. And so while we maintain authority, I think it's really helpful for us to remember all the time that children are human beings too. That sounds really dumb, But a lot of the things that breach or kind of that damage or wound relationships for us as adults apply for children as well. So unkind words, um, in being inconsiderate of their feelings or their emotions, or forgetting that they are in a time and a place too. So sometimes when you descend into their time and space and demand that they do something, it's a jolt for them. Maybe they need to stop everything, but we are understanding of the fact that that's a difficult transition. So I think like that's kind of, I think covers actually a lot of practical principles. If you
I think that's
say,
true. Can you be even just a little more specific? Just then give us some positive things to do there.
so for example, let's say your child is playing and it's time to leave to go to get somewhere on time, and they're in the middle of a great creative play. Johnny, you need to come get your shoes on right now. It's time to leave. And Johnny's really right in the middle. He doesn't want to come. Johnny, you really need to come. Johnny's really having a hard time. Then maybe what you could say, Johnny, I know you're in the middle of such a great play, and this is so interesting for you, and it's very hard to leave when you're in the middle of something. Unfortunately, we have to leave right now. This will be here for you when we get back. Come, mommy will help you put your shoes on. So that's acknowledging to the child where the child is. And interestingly, of course, you have to do the work inside of yourself to see that in the child first before you can say to the child, oh, I know that's hard for you to stop right now. And that's where the merit actually lies, that you as a parent have stopped for a moment and looked at your child and actually seen something in them and acknowledged it in yourself first before you verbally acknowledge it to them. And that goes a long way. Those kind of experiences go a long way in helping the child see, my mother sees me. My mother sees me. She knows that this is hard. Now, she still needs him to come put his shoes on and get in the car, and that needs to be done. It's not like, oh, it's really hard for you. I know. Okay, well, we'll wait 15 minutes. No, so it's not, relationship is not giving in.
Here.
That's exactly right. And as a matter of fact, I think it's important to remember we have to actually continue to maintain our authority, because the relationship of authority provides a further reason for the child to listen when you speak, right? It's not just because you're anybody you're not just the nice lady who understood why it was hard for him to stop playing his creative play. He actually recognizes this is a person who has authority over me, and authority is acting for the good of the other. And she has a relationship with me, and therefore it's doubly more of a reason to give pause to what she says. So
sure, no, that's great, and I think that's I love the line. Authority is fundamentally about relationship. Authority is given to somebody in a context where, especially when we're talking about parenting, where it's going to be exercised in the context of relationship, and in some sense unto relationship, and that has many concrete implications, and that's, you've just given us a few of them.
And one thing I just want to add to that that's very difficult is that the more we hone ourselves to where our child is psychologically and emotionally in a given situation, the more we can be tempted to kind of see where they are in a psychological and emotional situation as the ultimate defining statement in that situation. And it's not. The good of the child is actually the defining thing in any given situation. And so we are having to exercise a real kind of maturity and broader vision, which is exactly what children aren't able to do, right? So this is why it's given to us, that we recognize their response, their emotional response, their difficulty in accepting this or that. And then we also see what is their greater good. And we have to have a balance between the two, where we see and acknowledge, and we see where we need to draw them on. But we always continue to keep in our vision where we're asking them to come and why we're doing that. And that's very important. So I'm not at all suggesting that by becoming aware of their emotional kind of status, that becomes the defining element, is where
great.
they are emotionally.
That's great. Good. All right. So let's. I love that. Let's range around a little bit. Thank you. And if you, I'm going to toss out. Tell me, I've shared this with you before, so you can give me any feedback, or if you want to clarify anything. This is a point that I think is super helpful. At one point, St. Thomas Aquinas makes a point about what he calls spiritual goods, the higher kind of goods. I'm just going to give the principle, bam, straight out here. Spiritual goods, to be known, need to be tasted. Sometimes you need to do them if you're going to come to know them. And he says, thus, before they're done and known, they don't really bring about any desire in us. They're not very appealing to us. And this very much applies in the case of children, right? Material, lower things are immediately exciting to them, immediately appealing to them, and they tend to run around after them. And a key to maturing is to expose them to deeper, richer things that if they're not exposed to, they won't really know that they're there unless they won't want them.
Right.
And so I love how Plato tended to put this of the immature are inexperienced in pleasure. It's another way of putting that they haven't really tasted, not tasting, they don't really know. And these deeper, richer things. So if one way of casting the whole thing of forming our children is forming their desires, forming what they delight in. And if St. Thomas's point here is true, one simple way of putting that is give them opportunities to taste good things. And this to me is an overarching principle that very much fits with our whole program here. It's something through which to consider much of what we do in our homes together if we're trying to form children, raise children who will make good decisions. They're going to make good decisions because they want more important things, the richer things, the deeper things. They prioritize them. The only way you really prioritize the most important things is if you love them and want them most. If someone who's just purely acting out of duty, well, I've been told this is most important, I've been told I'm going to be punished if I don't do this, that just doesn't have much staying power. And that's not what we're trying to give. We're trying to give them, form their heart in such a way that they're going to want to prioritize this. Well, how do you form their heart? You got to show it to them. We talked about being an example, but forming daily life in the home as the context for tasting spiritual goods. That's the way I love to put it. Make our home a place that we, in various and sundry ways, are helping them taste these higher things. Immediately want to clarify the word spiritual here. Doesn't simply mean religious. I mean spiritual in the sense of
not material,
of basically not material.
Yeah.
So, for instance, the good of friendship,
yeah,
is a spiritual good. The good of a communion together and reading a story out loud,
or the good of sharing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Of really opening your heart and listening to one another. These are spiritual goods. This is the deeper stuff of life. This is the kind of thing, very concrete, that makes a person say, it's worth saying no to disordered bodily pleasures when there are these deeper kinds of human pleasures. It's unpleasant ever to mention things like, but we have to, pornography. How many turn to pornography just because there aren't other enjoyable things in their life? At one point, in fact, Thomas Aquinas says, those who are not tasting and experiencing, thus getting to know the higher pleasures, will of course tend to turn to the lower ones. This explains an awful lot about human life, and especially the culture and age in which we live. So it's a very gives a great principle for just thinking about our home and all those things that we love to talk about, having a certain kind of work together, have a certain kind of leisure time together, to be doing this under the rubric of let them taste the richness of life. Give them an experience of the kind of things that make them say, yes, these are the kind of things that life is especially worth living for. And that's right. I hope that's already concrete enough, right? We can make a list of reading out loud together, singing together, going for that walks where we're really present to one another. We all know this is what children so love. That's if we're really giving them our heart and putting our heart into it. This is more important than so many other things we might have prioritized in their formation, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly saying that they're experiencing these good things in the context of a relationship of love, which makes the things lovable, right? But I love your point that you said that St. Thomas says that it's hard to recognize spiritual goods. until you've tasted them. And it's interesting because very young children are very much rooted in their body. All of their initial knowledge comes from their experience. That's why mothers have to hold them and touch them. And they put things in their mouth. Everything's very physical. And so it's so interesting that they come from this place of everything is just, of course, the material. And you have to somehow lead them beyond the material, that there's this good in the spiritual. And so it struck me that, one way, that we very often do, especially with young children, is precisely, I use the example of sharing. Share. And that's very much separating the child from an experience of the immediate experience of the material good, and inviting them into an experience of the spiritual good, of being communal. And as parents, we all know how well that goes with the young child. Not very well. It's very, very difficult. And so it just struck me that, we could be making an effort to pattern for our children, putting aside material goods for the sake of spiritual goods. But it struck me that maybe what we should be really working on, kind of a first virtue as an introduction into a tasting of the goodness of the spiritual goods, is to instill in our children a spirit of gratitude. That's something that's easy to teach a young child to do. Thank you, mommy, for dinner. Thank you, daddy, did you say thank you for your brother for picking that up? So, or parents saying thank you to one another. It's something that doesn't ask them to give away a material good that they need to be weaned from. They don't, that is their security.
That's great. That's a great
point.
And
it gives them an incredible experience of unity, to looking at the other instead of at oneself, a generosity. So I think gratitude is kind of the almost parent virtue, to kind of give the child a hand over that first bridge into tasting of spiritual goods. And then also, as we try to create, as conscientious parents who are trying to create an environment where spiritual goods are, reading great books and beautiful art and singing good songs, those are all things that can be kind of become a dead end in themselves, right? A lovely home. It can become kind of a dead end if it's not seen as something bigger than even itself.
Yes, good.
Gratitude is the thing that allows your child to receive all of these wonderful things you're creating around them in the home, and lead them to something bigger and beyond that they want to invite others into, rather than becoming a place that they kind of own through as kind of a entitlement. Right?
I think that's incredible. Gratitude already itself is a kind of spiritual good. And gratitude is, even if it's gratitude for something material that was just given me, with children it almost always will be. You're not so much grateful for the bread that was given as for the heart that gave
the giver. Yeah.
And so gratitude always does bring you to a deeper spiritual reality. That's an incredibly good point. And what also, if I may, what that really strikes me there is to remind ourselves of the deep interconnection between the spiritual and material. We're not separating them. We're bringing them together here. To see the primacy of the spiritual is to really to bring them together. The home is a place that we cultivate a taste for the spiritual, or reverence for the spiritual, precisely in and through material things. That's the home is where exactly by God's design this happens. I mean, just think of all the little ways that we join hearts with one another, say, through the material things of our home. We give ourselves to one another in our singing, in the game that we play, in our walking together. We're putting the spiritual into the material. We're seeing the spiritual through the material. Home is precisely where that should most happen in human life. So to say that we're trying to cultivate a taste for the spiritual doesn't turn our eyes away from the material accoutrements of our daily life. It makes us look at them with a new eye and say, how can we make these material things, this material arrangement, be a way to convey deeper spiritual things?
Let me just take let's take a pause right here and just do a quick inventory of what we've kind of collected, a bunch of disparate facts, toward this end of how do we help our children make good choices once they leave home. Can we just take a quick inventory?
We probably should wrap up. I mean, that and continue. We could keep going a little bit here, but I mean, I think we we've done a lot here. Should we make an inventory, and then if it seems like anything absolutely needs to be added, we'll make a quick addition? How about that?
Yeah, that sounds great. So first, to begin with, we discussed what is the good, and the good is acting in a way that is most consonant with our human nature. And as the ancients have showed us, that is through acting in the virtues. So that means when we say good choices, we're saying choices that are based in virtue, that help encourage and grow and strengthen virtue so that they can flourish as a human being. Those are the
coming from a love for that good.
Yes, choosing them for the right reason.
Out of love,
Exactly.
having seen the real beauty of this for which we're made.
Yes. And so then we discussed how can we do that how can we prepare our children for that? And then we said that virtue is not something you can make someone do. It has to be something they choose to do from the inside. So as parents, our primary role is to create an environment that helps foster the appetite for good things.
Good.
Okay. And one of the ways that we create that environment, first of all, is through a relationship.
And I'd say most fundamentally, it's not like it's just a means. Well, let's have a good relationship so we can form them.
Yes.
It's like it's the very context, the foundation for our formation.
Oh, but actually, I forgot one point. Before we get to that point, we had said that the parents need to themselves strive to live that life of virtue from a desire for the virtues.
And that they're doing that together, that energy, the source of energy for the formation of the young is that the kind of throbbing
relationship between the parents.
Growth.
Yeah.
A throbbing growth. But a throbbing relationship.
Yes. Yes. And that relationship becomes the foundation from which the children are invited into a personal relationship with each of the parents individually. And the health of that relationship between the child and the parent is what helps the child to realize that their parent can be trusted. And therefore, what the parent shows them as regards what should be liked, what shouldn't be liked, what is beautiful, what is lovely, what is good, they trust the parent. And it becomes their first guide in developing an appetite. And also, when the child sees that the parent is acting out of love for them, then they begin to want those things that the parent is showing them as something that they also love together with their parent. So again, it's relationship that where the parent has proven that they are centered toward the good of their child. So, and that's the parent recognizing that sometimes our motivations are more mixed than we think. So that gives us a little bit of
good.
And then ultimately we talked about some of the things that help children grow in a desire for good things is recognizing the difference between material, the hierarchy of goods. So the material is lower than the spiritual, although they're united. And the material leads us very often to an experience of the spiritual. And that sometimes one of the best ways of introducing that experience, especially to the young, is a spirit of gratitude.
Great.
So how are we doing?
Yep, great. And
Did I miss something?
Well, no, but just a little bit more of an emphasis on there of the cultivating the spiritual goods of certain things. We might need to find new ways of working together or of spending leisure time together that are richer. And maybe this is, a theme we've talked about other times, kind of more leisure as opposed to entertainment. There's a place for entertainment, but tasting those spiritual goods, give them the kind of thing that tends not to be happening in homes because you don't have a thriving spousal relationship where they're being intentional about thinking, what can we be doing together starting from the life we share with one another and the work and leisure that we have together, and invite them that we're doing this all and in all of those manifold rich ways, in those things that tend to not be so common in homes anymore. That's why I like to just kind of keep going back and saying those simple examples like reading out loud together and singing together and telling stories, going for that walk, going for that hike, enjoying nature, reading, observing Sunday. Right? We have a podcast on that. It was a special time for, was reading scripture out loud together, reading great literature out loud together. There's truly a spiritual, particularly for it's all about relationship. We're sharing our heart. These are spiritual things. These are things that lead higher and higher.
And I'll just mention before we wrap up here, we focused a lot on children. It sounded like the children are really young. And I just want to acknowledge that there is a real transition for children going from young childhood through adolescence into teenagerhood and adulthood. That is can be a very painful time of transition, of big change and discovery and finding their equilibrium in a different environment for the first time. And in that very, very trying time, even if you've created a really awesome, positive environment and the relationship is very good, it can be very difficult for the child in trying to discern, which way do I go? What is it that I love? What do I want to do? And these are just really hard times for both the child and for the parent, because it kind of almost blindsides you. So where did this come from? That's not the kind of home that this child has been growing and living in. And in a certain sense, I think it just goes with the territory that you experience it as this almost, it's like a second birth. It's like a second labor. And this time the child is experiencing, well, the parents totally experience it too. And I think that I just want to say that resting on a kind of a confidence in a relationship that is person-centered, that is loving, that is virtue-centered, is the stuff that helps you weather those times. It doesn't make those times less painful, but it's what actually gives you hope that on the other side, when everything begins to settle down, there's a lot of bodily stuff that's going on too that kind of accounts for a lot of the disquiet that doesn't really have to do with their will and their volition. It clouds the will, and it makes it makes it harder for them to see clearly. What do I want? What do I need to choose? It's just, there's a physiological, heavy duty physiological component. When all that settles down, very often what they come back to is, what do they rest in? And it's the experience of love and belonging and respect and affirmation and delight in the good that they experience in their household.
So what I hear you saying there is patience and hope,
and confidence in the good too.
That forecast for them, project into them our confidence that they're going to be okay. And this isn't to be blind to the problems. It's not to leave problems unaddressed, but fundamentally that they know that we know that they're going to choose well, that we are, or as it were, forecasting their success. We have confidence in them. Again, not in a way that's blind to the reality, but I think that when they see, if we get completely ruffled by the struggles that they're having, that will make them be more ruffled by them.
Uncertain.
We need to be that steady. Okay, we're with you in this, and we know you're struggling right now. You're going to be all right, and that's where it's going to have to deepen our relationship. We know. I mean, these are challenging things. It's going to take us to prayer, and it's going to bring us all closer together.
Yeah, and it's expressing a confidence that the good that we've been trying to show them all along is real and objective outside of them. It's not something that's subject to our doing it successfully, looking the right way, saying the right things, living the right. It's simply, it is there. That's why we've been showing it to them this whole time. Yep. And that it's something that's there, it's constant, it's always present, and it's there for their choosing. And when we keep our eyes on that good and don't let ourselves get ruffled by the waves, it gives them something constant to see and reach for in the turbulence.
Steady onward.
Absolutely.
Steady onward with ultimately and trust in the Lord, and a wonderful plan that we do our best to bring ourselves into more conformity with, and do that for and do that with our children. Well,
absolutely.
Dear, thanks so much for this conversation.
Yeah.
Great to be with you all. We look forward to next time.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in this episode of The Intentional Household. If you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and leave a rating or review. If you have any topic requests, please send them to lifecraftgroup@gmail.com. For our Wednesday reflections, free courses, reading groups, and live events, please visit life-craft.org.